Machine binding a quilt or a pillow cover is the exact same method. It's actually really easy, and I will show you how to machine bind using this pillow cover here. Start by cutting out some binding. To do this, you'll need 2.5-inch strips of fabric cut to the width of your fabric, and then you will cut as many as you need and sew them together using about a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Once you've done this, then press all of these strips together, wrong sides facing in. Now you have created your binding. To attach your binding to a quilt or a pillow cover, start with the back side of that pillow cover or quilt. Lay your binding with the raw edge along the edge and clip it in place, just along one side. You will need a 1/4-inch sewing foot because you will be sewing a 1/4-inch seam allowance along this edge. Start between 6 to 12 inches in on your binding. Start with a back stitch and sew almost all the way down to that bottom corner. Give yourself a little bit of room so that you can fold your binding across, giving yourself this crease where you will stop your needle at, pivot, and then do a back stitch off that corner. So here I am at the sewing machine. I've got my 1/4-inch sewing foot lined up along the edge of that binding. I'm going to start with a back stitch, and once again I am starting leaving myself between 6 to 12 inches before I actually start sewing along that binding. Pause sewing along that edge just a little bit before you get to that bottom corner. That way you have a little bit of space to work with your binding to create that crease that we spoke of. So you'll fold your fabric across, finger press a crease into your binding, and then you can sew to that bottom crease. Now, if you find that sewing to a crease is too difficult for you, you can't really see the crease, then what you can do is just take a little measuring tool and measure a 1/4 inch up, draw a mark, and that will be the mark that you will stop your needle into. So as you can see here, I'm sewing all the way to my crease or my mark. I will stop with my needle in the fabric, then pick up that sewing foot and pivot my fabric so that I can sew off that corner. Make sure to back stitch when you are sewing off of this corner, and then you can cut your threads. We are halfway done our corner. Now what you'll do is you will take your binding, fold it back up and then over so that it lays along your next edge. Pin it in place. Start using a back stitch and then sew all the way down to that bottom's edge. Hopefully you can see what I mean a little bit better here. So here I am folding my binding to the right, and then I fold it back on over so it lines up with the next edge. One pin on the top left of my binding to hold it in place, and then a few clips along the next edge that I will be sewing. Then take your sewing foot and start at that top edge, do a back stitch. Sometimes your needle can get a little bit stuck with all of this fabric. I like to use my sewing stiletto to help my sewing machine get going. And then you can sew all the way down to your next corner, doing the exact same method that I showed you again and again until you have completed all 4 corners. Now, one very important thing to remember is after you finish that 4th corner, only sew a little bit because you need to leave yourself between 6 to 12 inches of your binding loose once again. It will just make it easier to connect the 2 ends together in the next step. And of course, don't forget to backstitch when you stop. Now, as you can see here, I've only left myself about 4 inches between where I started and where I stopped. I actually recommend that you leave yourself a lot more space than this. Between 6 to 12 inches of space, it will just make it easier to sew those 2 ends together. To figure out where to connect my binding, I'll lay it on top of my cutting mat and use its markings as a guide. I'll first find the center of the open space and I'll fold both sides of binding outwards and give a finger press so that I've got a crease on both sides. Then the left side, I will measure a 1/2 inch in from the folded crease, and I will snip away the excess fabric. We'll be sewing using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is why I'm measuring out a 1/2 inch before I cut away the excess. As you can see here, I have left 1/2 inch of fabric past that finger crease that we created. Then take the right side of your binding and lay it so that it overlaps your left side of binding. Then measure 1 inch from the left piece of binding, the end of it, in, and you can cut your right piece of binding so that it is 1 inch overlapping your left piece of binding. Then you can butt up both ends of your binding together, give it a final finger crease before you open them up so that you lay both ends right sides together, pin across that end, take it to your sewing machine, and you will sew across that finger crease, or if you want, just remember to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance across that top edge, starting and stopping with a back stitch. This will complete your binding. Then just lay your binding so that it's wrong sides in once again, and just open up that seam that you just sewed. Then pin across that final edge, then sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance across your binding, starting and stopping with a back stitch, finishing up that side. Then before we sew it on the other side of our quilt or pillow cover, I suggest you take it to your iron and you just press your binding away from the center fabric. I do this on the corners and on the edges. I find that it gives me a little bit more fabric to work with when we switch to the other side. Then flip your project over and start clipping your binding all the way around your entire project, whether it's a pillow, a table runner, or a quilt. Pay special attention to the corners. The way that I like to fold them is so that they are opposite from the fold on the other side. I find that it reduces bulk. And now it's time to attach the other side of our binding. To do this, I like to use a top stitch. I lengthen my stitch to around 3 millimeters. Always start with a back stitch and follow along the edge of your binding. Go all the way around, making sure, of course, to catch those corners with your sewing needle. It's best not to start sewing your binding at a corner, but start in the center of the binding and work your way towards a corner. Then make sure your needle lands inside that corner before you put your needle down and pivot and continue sewing around your entire project. And that is how you add binding to any project using a sewing machine. I hope you found this helpful. If you want more beginner sewing tutorials like this one, please hit subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.